everyone, and welcome to Findmypast Fridays. We're very excited to be with you. I'm Jen Baldwin. I'm the Data Acquisition Manager for North America. We're just going to give it a couple of seconds to catch up, make sure that people are actually watching. Hope everybody is doing well out there today. We're just waiting to make sure that people are on. So say hello as you join the live stream. We're excited to have you with us on Fridays, as always. Excellent. I think we're seeing a few people now come alive. Hope everybody's doing well on Friday. Hello, Andrew. Thanks for chiming in. And Linda. So I'm going to just be really clear. This is actually the first time that my colleagues have given me the full reins on Findmypast Fridays. It's my first solo. So that's a good time. I'm always happy to be with the community, though. So for those who are joining us maybe for the first time, or maybe you haven't participated very much, Findmypast Fridays occurs, of course, every Friday at this time, 4 o'clock UK time, 9 a.m. Mountain time, where I'm located. So we're always excited to be with you, to talk to our community, to share our new records, to talk about discoveries. And so if you're new, make sure that you reach out and post in the comments. Say hello, let us know where you're from, so that we can connect with you and that you can connect with everybody else. There are some incredibly talented, incredibly intelligent people that kind of watch normally, regularly with us. So it's always good to ask questions, because this is a great chance for you to connect with someone who might have similar interests in research or be able to help you. So fantastic. We have a bunch of people chiming in. Jackie, Kathy from New Jersey. Thank you, Kathy. Karen, Denise, Jenny. I went by Jenny when I was a kid, but I went to Jen when I moved to college. Beverly from Bedfordshire. Gail from Wisconsin. Oh, Madison, Wisconsin. Actually, that's where my brother got married. Pat's with us. Hillary's with us from Wales. Roz from Massachusetts. Ian also from North Wales. Anna. All sorts of people. It's so good to see you all. Maureen, hello. Thank you all. And Daphne from a humid Somerset. Yeah, I understand it's supposed to be quite hot in the UK today. About 100 degrees, I think, Fahrenheit, right? This is the equivalent over here. Ain says North Fife and it's a gray-white heat wave. Bev in Tucson, Arizona. I bet you're pretty hot today as well. Linda in Ontario, Canada. Thank you so much for being with us. Oh, this is great. Look at all these people. Patricia is in Cyprus. David, hello. Gary, hello from Devon. Ellen from Roscoe, Illinois. Oh, and Sharon from Western Australia. Excellent. I don't remember what time it is in Sharon. I was in Australia right now. I was just looking at the time difference in Australia yesterday, actually. So I should know that off the top of my head, but I don't. All right. Well, today we have a lot to talk about. And we also have Niall in the comments in our Irish office, in our Ireland office. So if everybody would say hello to Niall too, because he is with us. And it's always good to have someone watching the comments for me. It's all very, very helpful. Linda says very humid in Northeast Scotland, very unusual. Yeah, it's usually not quite so bad. So, all right, well, let's talk about all of the things today. We've got a lot to cover. Our question of the week, let's start with that. And please do comment. Let us know what you think about this. My question today is, have you found that any of your ancestors were involved in the East India Company, the British East India Company, whether they were involved in the trade aspect or the military aspect of that company in later years, or at any point in their history, right? The British East India Company lasted over 2 centuries, so there's a lot of potential connections and, of course, had a huge influence. So we're going to talk about that later in the hour, but answer that. That's our question today. If you had anybody involved in the British East India Company, we'd love to hear your stories. Claire says, snow in the Flinders Ranges regional area of South Australia. That is insane. I think I saw some pictures from a friend this morning who had posted something that their time. I was trying to figure out in my head, but I couldn't. So that's, yeah, the snow in Australia was just nuts. Beautiful pictures, though. Oh, Rosie wants to know if how the weather is in Ireland. So Niall, you're all over that, right? Ray is with us. And ancestors from Nottinghamshire and County Durham. Yeah, that's fantastic. Hi, Ray. I hope you're doing well. It's just so good to connect with everybody. I really look forward to these sessions because it's so fun to talk to everybody and just connect on all these kind of common connections, right? As we talk about our family history. All right, so make sure that you're paying attention to that question of the week one more time for those in the back. All right, if your ancestors were involved in the British East India Company at all, we'd love to hear your stories and talk about what you have discovered in relation to the British East India Company and its impact over history. So I actually discovered something, or I should say rediscovered something this a couple of weeks ago that led to that question. And it ties nicely with our new records this week. So let's go over what we launched this week. A bunch of new records as per usual. But we're going to focus on the brand new Hampshire parish registers we've added to the existing Hampshire collection. So we've got 21,000 new baptisms, 15,000 new marriages, 15,000 new burials, and these all start in 1538, which, you know, from an American perspective, that's pretty dang early, and run into various years. So the baptisms run up to 1912. The marriages run up to 1933, and the burials go up to 1897. These are provided by the Surrey History Center and the Surrey County Council, so we're really grateful to them as partners. And really some really cool records right in here. It's a great collection. So if you have Hampshire connections and you haven't looked at this record set in the last 24 hours, actually. This is your chance. This is your time to go back in and look at this collection and figure out if you've missed anything. You know, when we do an update like this to a collection and add more, what I usually do is I go back and I look at that part of my tree that has that geographical connection, and I go just one person at a time and say, do I have a baptism? Do I have a marriage? Do I have a burial? What do I not know? And just check the database, literally just one person at a time, and update my tree. So make sure that you've got your tree on Findmypast as well. That'll start to hint through if you want hints into these new records. So take advantage of all those tools, right? But take, an hour or two today, escape from the heat and sit inside. I don't know if people have air conditioning across the UK. I don't think that's very standard in the UK. I'm not sure. But if you have AC, sit inside during the hottest part of the hour and just work through these New Hampshire records and update your tree. So this is a great chance to do that. So let me just scroll back because I saw some comments. I know we had some responses to our question of the week. Robert says no relative in the East India Company, but I did have one relative in England who was shipped off as a convict to Australia. Anna says the weather is fabulous in Dublin, so that's fantastic. Karen says she has lots of connections in her husband's family to the British East India Company, and also connected to raffles. Are you meaning rifles? But with a question mark. So Karen, that's a good question. Hopefully someone can address that as well in the chat. That's fantastic. So good. Andrea's here. Hello, Andrea. It's good to have you. Sue from Surrey. Jackie's from Oxfordshire. The heat wave is definitely here. Yeah, she's offering to share it. That's really nice of you, Jackie, to share. That's so sweet. Cheryl's coming in from California. That's fantastic. It's 8:00 in the morning in California, so that's great. All right. Hillary says lots of Hampshire family going all the way right back. Hillary, it's great to have you with us. Hopefully these new records will be of help to you if you haven't found all those connections yet in those vital events. Linda says her mystery man was supposedly from Hampshire. Oh, Linda, tell us more about the mystery man. We want to know. We want to know all of these things. And Dina's from Colorado. Oh, good. Another Colorado person. That's great. Lovely to have you with us. It would be great to connect with you and network on Colorado research here, if you have any, to talk to you a little bit about U.S. research. Georgia, no air conditioning. Oh, most people in the UK do not have AC. All right. Okay. Well, Andy, and I like give me some credit. I don't know much about the UK in the summer. It's called a window. Well, hopefully you all have a nice breeze to come in through those open windows. Oh, Andy, the only AC here are my initials. That's great. All right. And lots more. Oh, Debbie from Dallas, Texas. Fantastic. Okay, good. So let's keep chatting. It's great to see everybody. Karen from Washington. I think that's Washington State, I would have to assume. That's good. All right. So Hampshire records are exciting. And please do take a look. Make sure that you update your tree. Carol's coming in from New York State. That's fantastic. Miko's giving us some information, of course, on the East India Company. There's more than just the British one. We are going to talk specifically about the British one today. And he's got a bit of a story there, it looks like, and about eating biscuits. I could go for a biscuit right now, Miko, so that sounds good. All right, but so this Hampshire collection, this update to the Hampshire records, really made me think about my connections in kind of southern England just as a whole. And I don't actually have any, I don't think, from Hampshire specifically. I have a couple from Devon and other nearby areas, but not from Hampshire that I could find. I do have some interesting information. Made me think about what else, what other impact Hampshire made. And you can find, a handful of famous people in these records, right? Jane Austen's baptism can be found in 1775 from this collection. But when I think of Hampshire, I actually think of Southampton. And the reason of that, of course, is because of my American education and background. And I don't have a connection to the Mayflower, but the Mayflower has been in the news a lot. We're coming up on the 400th anniversary of its departure from England. And I wanted to look and see what the connection was to Southampton. I knew it was docked, is that the right word? Docked in Southampton for a little while. So I wanted to learn a little bit more about that. So I've been researching that. And then actually the Mayflower actually left Southampton on August 15th, 1620, which is just 6 days away. So we're almost exactly at the 400th anniversary of the Mayflower leaving Southampton. Now, there's a little bit of a backstory here. The Separatists, right, which is how the Pilgrims were referred to in that time, they actually, of course, were living, many of them were living in Holland, right, for many years. I think 10 or 11 years they'd been in Holland. And they actually had arranged to meet their counterparts in Southampton. And there was actually 2 vessels, right? There was the Mayflower and the Speedwell, both intended on making the journey into the New World. Their objective in Southampton was to just kind of stock up and get both ships ready and depart with just after a few days of meeting together. But the Speedwell was really leaky, and so it had to be repaired. They spent quite a bit more time in Southampton than they intended to. The Pilgrims actually slept on board the ships, but they went into town regularly, spent their days kind of shopping for supplies. And one of the good things that came out of this was that there were individuals who had made the journey or had sailed across the Atlantic before. And of course, those were kind of few and far between at that point. And so they had the chance to talk to those individuals and gain from their experience in terms of what they needed to take and what the journey might be like and all sorts of things. So they actually were kind of took advantage of the situation in a good way, right? They were able to kind of network and gain from that experience, right? So the other thing that happened when they were in Southampton is they met Stephen Hopkins. And when he joined the journey, he was the only passenger on the Mayflower known to have previous experience in America. So he was shipwrecked in Bermuda in 1609. While he was shipwrecked, they were stranded there for 10 months. He participated in organizing a mutiny against the governor, and he was actually sentenced to death, then later pardoned. And his goal, after he got back to the UK, his wife had passed away. His first wife had passed away while he was in America the first time. So he married again, and his goal was to move his family to Virginia. So he was sailing on the Mayflower with his second wife, who was actually one of the 3 women who were pregnant. She was at least 6 months pregnant when they left. She gave birth actually during the voyage. So yeah, a lot actually happened with Stephen Hopkins later when they got to Virginia, but we're not going to get into that too much. But that's where he joined the journey, is because of their delay in Southampton. So then, of course, the Mayflower and the Speedwell then actually depart, right? A couple weeks late, but then they get delayed in Dartmouth again. And then they leave Dartmouth. They eventually get about 300 miles off of Land's End, and both ships turn around and head back for Plymouth. They'd been at sea for 6 weeks since they left London and Leiden. They wasted a lot of money because the Speedwell was still leaking. So they ended up going back into Plymouth for more repairs. Eventually, the Speedwell was declared unfit to make the voyage completely. Some passengers actually just abandoned the entire venture. Some stayed in Plymouth, and the rest boarded the Mayflower, which was now, of course, completely overcrowded and very cramped. And they finally left England for the last time, September 16th, 1620. It was so much more than just getting on the Mayflower and heading to the New World, right? There's so much more history there. So all these new records from Hampshire kind of cover this area. It's always very interesting to kind of think about the effect of a historical event, right? We think of the Mayflower just kind of coming across and that being that, but actually there was a lot of repercussions from the fact that they were delayed in Southampton. Now, the date of their actual departure gets a little confusing, right? There's a couple people who will tell you that they left on not a couple people. There's people who will say they left on the 16th, and then there are people who will say that they left on the 6th of September. And of course, what happened is the calendar changed, right? So when they left in their time frame, the voyagers would have referred to it as the 6th of September. That's the date they would have known. But today, historically, we look back and it's our 16th of September equivalent. And so the anniversary is actually celebrated on the 16th of September. Huge event, of course, for anybody with kind of North American connections or just interested in global history, right? Oh, yes, Miko is reminding me, before they set off, before the Mayflower arrived in Southampton, they set off from Rotherhithe, London, and a year or two ago, I think, yep, Miko and I went and had a drink at the Mayflower pub, and it's the same building that has been there since 1550. Thanks for reminding me of that, Miko. That was a great afternoon. And they have an American flag actually just out over the river, marking the place where the Mayflower was docked. So that was actually a pretty cool moment for me as an American, as a historian. It's so great. All right, looking at the comments again. Audrey's here. Thank you for joining us, Audrey. It's so great. She is in Buckinghamshire, where some of the Pilgrims came from. And she visited Plymouth Plantation. I can't pronounce it, a few years ago. It's fantastic. Andrew asks, can you give advice on finding Kansas marriages and deaths online? And yes, I can. And actually, quickly, Andrew, this is a great question. On Findmypast, we have a collection called the United States Marriages. It's actually the largest online collection of U.S. marriages available on the internet. So start there, U.S. marriages. Go to the A to Z on Findmypast and just type in United States Marriages. It'll come right up. And start your search for those Kansas marriages there. In terms of deaths, you'd have to check the Kansas state policy. Every state, and in fact almost all counties in the United States, are run differently in terms of records access. So look at, if you know the county, that's the best place to start, but look at least Kansas state policy in terms of public access to death records, depending on the time frame that may or may not be available. He also tells me that Speedwell is a wildflower in the UK, which I did not know. Thank you for that, Andrew. I'm going to look it up. All right, so that's my story about our records this week. We've got thank you, Niall, for sharing the link to U.S. marriages. Of course, I should have known you would do that. Fantastic. So take a look at that link if you have questions about U.S. vital records. Jonathan says his 4 times great-grandfather started off as a captain's servant in 1782 at the age of roughly 10 with the East India Company, have then established his career path up through the EIC to ultimately becoming a managing owner of a ship in 1820. Wow, that's fascinating. Have traced many of his journeys to India and China, was also involved in the battle in the Battle of Pulu Ora in 1804. Jonathan, that's fantastic research. Awesome. You know, when I hear things like that, I would love to see it mapped, right? Like a infographic of some kind of his voyages. Like that's how I would want to present that information. I don't really know how to do that, but I think it would be really cool if you could figure it out. What a great story and fascinating research. And Keith says, I've tried to find any ancestors or any connections with the John Jenny who left for the America on the latter ship after the Mayflower. He built the first grist mill. Have you had any further info? Please contact him. Our family's from Lincoln, moved to Birmingham, UK in the 1800s. So I can give you a quick suggestion. Actually, Keith, one of the best resources for early travel into America is actually the New England Historic Genealogical Society or AmericanAncestors.org. Pretty sure it's .org, not .com. But they have produced a collection called the Great Migration Directory, and it covers up to 1640 or 1645. I have the book over my shoulder. That's why I'm glancing. But check out the Great Migration Collection on American Ancestors. Keith, that would be a great place for you to start because there was a period there, right, from the Mayflower up to about 1640 where there was just thousands of people coming into New England especially. So make sure that you take a look at that. Karen's coming in from Moses Lake, Washington. I actually used to live near Moses Lake. So that's fantastic. Thanks. I grew up in that area. Thanks for being with us, Karen. All right, so let's keep going. I want to really talk about the East India Company today. And one of the reasons that I brought this up actually is because during the lockdown, right, during quarantine, I've been going through all of my research. I don't want to admit how old I am per se, but let's just call it 30 years worth of document gathering. Because I've been doing this since I was a kid. And I've been just working through and giving everything full citations and organizing everything and really just getting myself back to where I should be, right? And while I was doing this, I found this story that I printed out a long time ago. I printed this in 2005, thinking that it might be a connection to one of my early American lines. Now, this is on my maternal side of my family. And I think that one of my possible ancestors was a man named Henry Timberlake. Now, Henry, there's quite a bit known about him. He was born in 1570. He was a prosperous London ship captain and a merchant adventurer. Now, I have Timberlakes in Virginia back to the early 1700s, so pre-Revolutionary War. And there is kind of a theory out there that this Henry Timberlake was actually, kind of their grandfather, great-grandfather. And he actually made a very early journey to Virginia and America, right? What became America. So here's this very prosperous kind of ship captain and adventurer. He dies in September of 1627 in Titchfield, Hampshire, and he's buried at St. Peter's Church. He was 55 years old when he died. So I actually looked when these records came on. These new records from Hampshire came available this morning. I jumped on and I was able to find his burial in this some of these new records. So that was pretty exciting. But according to this little printout thing that I've got, it's 8 or 9 pages or whatever, and it's actually somebody's like student paper from the University of Southern Colorado. So it's got citations and everything. So that's good. He was according to this. He was a member of the Merchant Adventurers of England and a joint stockholder in the East India Company. And I'm thinking, gosh, that was really, really early, right? And one of the comments is Justin Timberlake, one of your cousins? I don't know. And I'm going to be honest, I'm not sure that I care. It would be kind of cool. But I don't actually know. I haven't actually spent a lot of time on the Timberlake side just yet. In later years, they were heavily involved in the slave trade, especially in the southern states of the United States. And it's just something that I haven't really faced, but I'm starting to do so now. I recognize I need to do that research. So I'm just starting to kind of get back into the Timberlake family. But this guy, Henry Timberlake, who was such an early adventurer, he wrote this manuscript. It was actually a letter that they published and turned into essentially a book after he died. It was called "A True and Strange Discourse on the Travels of Two English Pilgrims," and it was published several times after his death, but it was really focused on his adventures in Jerusalem and Alexandria, Egypt. And his whole kind of story through that. It's quite fascinating. But he had this early involvement with the East India Company, and I didn't really know that much about the early initial stages of the East India Company, so I decided to take a look at this. Now, the other connection, of course, from my perspective to the East India Company, the British East India Company, is, of course, its impact on the lead up to the American Revolutionary War, right? There's a reason all that tea was in Boston, and we're going to get to that, that of course became the Boston Tea Party, right? So all of this to introduce the topic of the week, if you will, on the British East India Company. So once again, if you have comments or connections to the British East India Company, throw your comments and your stories in the chat. We have one. This is my third time's great-grandfather was a waiter in the East India Club in London from 1881 before he moved from London up to Edinburgh. That's fantastic. Andy says, no relation to the Pilgrims. It was the 19th century before any of mine decided to depart the UK. Yeah, I think that's actually pretty common. But if you have... So, Andy, going back to what I was saying about the Great Migration. So, if they're not Great Migration period, so 1600s, and you're looking at 18th or 19th century rather, then go into the passenger list records on Findmypast. That might be a good place to help, and we'll have Niall share the link. All right, and then some other questions about finding relatives in the U.S. I'm going to keep going about the British East India Company, but I will, if I don't have time to answer those questions before the hour is over, I'll come back to them in the chat too after we're done. And then, of course, if anybody else has suggestions, please do throw them in. I see that Rosie has a comment in here about the Virtual Museum of Canada, which is a fantastic site in terms of the Loyalists. So absolutely. And Audrey commenting, collection of early immigrants is very useful. And yes, she points out it's the only source I know that can sometimes even give the reason for travel. Yeah, Audrey is a really good point. I love that collection. Absolutely fantastic. And it runs from 1636 to 1815. So it's, Audrey's absolutely right about that. It's fantastic. It's really, really fantastic material. Okay, so British East India Company. Let's take a look a bit. I want to talk through a little bit of their history, so we can all kind of explore this together. And because of this Henry Timberlake individual and my interest in him as a possible connection, I thought it would be worth our time to kind of explore the company itself. And I know some of you have already commented that you have connections to the military units, which is interesting. But what I learned actually about early years of the British East India Company was quite interesting. So the original name actually of the British East India Company was the Governor and Company of Merchants of London Trading into the East Indies. It's really quite a mouthful. Created by royal charter on the last day of the year of 1600. So it was kind of initially this old-fashioned or kind of early capitalist venture. Each voyage was essentially its own separate business venture with its own stockholders or subscribers, and that lasted about a dozen years. So they worked off that model for just over a decade. Of course, at this point, spice trade with the East Indies really relied on land routes across Asia and the Middle East, and that had been the case for centuries. But by the 16th century, the seas were opening up, and that kind of allowed Europeans to essentially cut out the middleman of those land routes and profit in greater numbers for the first time. So the Spanish and Portuguese had a monopoly on the East Indies spice trade until the destruction of the Spanish Armada in 1588, which really opens the door for the British and the Dutch. And of course, we probably all know that the British were not the only people, of course, to have an East India Company, right? The Dutch did as well. So there's quite a bit of hefty competition. In 1612, there was some competition in England to the British East India Company running up to this period. So in 1612, I'm going to backtrack, sorry, the company switches to temporary joint stocks. And if the research on Henry Timberlake is correct, he would have been around 42 years old at this point, just shy of a decade before he died. So the idea of him being a stock owner in the British East India Company in this period actually kind of makes sense with the history, so that's good. In 1657, they switched to permanent joint stocks. And then again, that competition starts to rise up. There's another group of English investors and merchants, and the two groups joined together in 1708 as the United Company of Merchants of England trading to the East Indies. Now, there's a few things happening in the background on overseas, right, as all of this is happening in England, right? In 1623, there's the Ambonia Massacre, where the Dutch essentially exclude company members from the East Indies, including English. So traders from England, Japan, and Portuguese were executed by Dutch authorities. Back in 1612, the Portuguese were defeated, actually, in India, and the British won the trading concessions from the Mughal Empire. And of course, the predominant products were cotton, silk piece goods, indigo, saltpeter, and spices were pretty common. And then, of course, tea comes into play in later years, right? Eventually, the company gains its own military and administrative departments. It essentially becomes its own imperial power. The British government starts to rein things in the late 18th century. But during this period, right, so now we're talking about almost a full 200 years, shareholders meetings are really making decisions about Britain's kind of de facto colonies in the East during this entire period, right? So they're making really substantial business decisions, but they're also making decisions essentially on behalf of Britain, which is, from my understanding, and maybe some of you know better, but have different research, but essentially unprecedented by this time, right? So then we get into the impact of the British East India Company kind of globally, right? It has a huge impact across the world. But for those of us specifically who have been thinking about the American Revolution and any kind of loyalist research, like some of you have been chatting about loyalists in the chat today, we start to see the impact on the American colonies, which at this point, of course, the 13 colonies include what we now know today as Nova Scotia, right? So this includes Canada. So in 1767, the British government and Parliament applies a tea tax on the American colonies. This results in a serious decline in consumption just when the company is really trying to strengthen its position in Canton and is purchasing greater and greater quantities of tea. So the statistics on this are actually pretty impressive. They went from selling 900,000 pounds of tea in 1769 to just 237,000 pounds of tea in 1772. So within just a few short years, they went from 900,000 pounds to 237,000 pounds. That's a huge loss, right, from a company perspective. So warehouses are just overflowing with tea. So the company, the British East India Company, actually negotiates with Parliament for the rights to sell tea directly to the colonies, which was granted in the Regulating Act of 1773. This is also known as the Tea Act. Now, while all of this is happening to the British East India Company, there are other taxes being applied on the American colonies because England is in a recession. And Parliament needs to find a way to increase revenue, and they see the colonies as a great way to do that. colonies aren't really enjoying that. So they're taking a stance of you can't tax without representation, and the parliament is saying, well, actually we can kind of do what we want because we're parliament and you're the colonies and we make the laws, right? So in 1772, the British East India Company actually requests £1 million loan to avoid bankruptcy. £1 million in 1772. That's a huge sum. Absolutely massive amount of money. And this negotiation results in the Regulating Act of 1773. So instead of seeking out a new market in the colonies, the act actually only just creates more opposition, right? The colonists see it as Parliament trying to shove taxes kind of on top of them. Parliament, again, is saying, well, hang on a second, we're in charge. You can't do this. Interestingly, I think after the Revolutionary War, the British East India Company actually stops having really any direct contact with America at all. The company, by the time the end of the Revolutionary War hits, the company is virtually bankrupt and has 18 million pounds of surplus tea sitting in London warehouses. Can you imagine the mountains of tea that equates to, right? 18 million pounds of surplus tea sitting in warehouses. So Regulating Act, or the Tea Act of 1773, eliminates all duties on tea that was re-exported to the colony. So at first they had to bring the tea from East India, back to London, and it was essentially sold to distributors. And then those distributors would take on the cost of shipping it to the colonies in North America. And so the profits were split, but there was still a lot of money changing hands, right? So this act essentially says you no longer have to do that. You can actually export it directly to the colonies. And what it did was it actually drove the cost of tea from Britain well below the smuggled Dutch tea, which lots of people in the colonies were profiting from, and gave the East India Company essentially a monopoly on tea sales in America. And so, of course, colonists and rebels say that this is a thinly veiled attempt to secure kind of colonial submission to this blanket principle of parliamentary taxation. And this is, of course, one of the biggest issues that caused the war, right? This is Britain's way of saying, and Parliament's way of saying, we're in charge, get over it, get used to it, right? You are our colony and you're supposed to follow the rules. Now, of course, the business of smuggling tea especially from Dutch sources into the colonies is huge money, right? So now you have angry politicians in the colonies because they don't want to be told what to do without any kind of voice in the situation. And you have angry merchants because they're losing money kind of hand over fist because of this loss of Dutch smuggling. So these two groups of people for the first time kind of band together and start what we now know of today as the American Revolution. So here we get into summer of 1773. The British East India Company, creates this plan and implements a plan to send tea to 4 major American ports: Charleston, Philadelphia, New York, and of course Boston. In New York and Philadelphia, when the vessels reached the ports and reached those colonies, they were actually just turned back by the locals who refused to allow the tea to land. Now, once the boat came into port, the timetables on the taxes started. So once you kind of went over that imaginary line in the water, you had so many days to pay the taxes on that import. In Charleston, the tea was unloaded, but the tax was just never paid. So they unloaded the tea and it was distributed and sold. In Boston, however, totally different story, as we know. The Massachusetts Bay governor, who was Thomas Hutchinson at the time, he was absolutely determined to send that message of who was in charge. So, of course, Boston's radicals didn't like that and would not allow the tea off the vessels. They patrolled the ports and they controlled the ports. So once the boats entered the port, the clock again started ticking on that tax. And eventually the tea would either revert from being the private property of the British East India Company, and it would turn into government property again. So the stalemate was kind of on, right? They had to do something before that tax due date came up. Because once it got reverted into government property, then they would just, they didn't care what the colonists said. They just would sell it anyway, and the whole thing would be moot. So December 16th, 1773, we have the event known now as the Boston Tea Party. These rebels are poorly disguised as Mohawks. They board the ships and dump 352 casks of tea worth 10,000 British pounds into the harbor. And the British regulars, there was, a British army unit standing by. They just had to stand there and watch. There's nothing they could do. So really fascinating, interesting conversation, and journey, right, as to how the British East India Company, actually impacted all of these global turns of events, right? And so here we have the Boston Tea Party, which most of us know is, kind of one of the kickoff events for the Revolutionary War. But of course, the British East India Company doesn't stop there, right? You then, so as America and England get drawn into war. Oh, Andy's done the math for us. That's fantastic. 1 million pounds in 1650 was worth approximately, oh gosh, there's a lot of numbers, 103.5 million pounds. Am I reading that right? 1 million is just over 103.5 million pounds in 2017. Andy, thanks for that comment. That's really interesting. It's a ton of money, right? And I've read accounts where, and you can find these pretty easy online or in books. The Boston Harbor had so much tea in it, and the way that the currents were running just that night and at the time that all this happened, that it was just like layers and layers of tea just floating on the water. So you had like this tea sludge, essentially, that it never really went out into the ocean. It kind of stayed in the harbor, just the way the currents work. And so you had this tea sludge floating across the top of the water for a couple of days. And they did find that some people were trying to shove tea into their pockets, and those people were actually, I think they were hung, actually, because this wasn't at all about self-profit, right? It was an act of rebellion, right, against the government. So anyway, I could talk all day about the Revolutionary War, but I won't. So British East India history continues, right? The India Act of 1704 is put into place. One of the things I found interesting, by 1785, the company itself had a staff in London of 159 people, but really they controlled millions of people across its empire. Can you imagine the impact of a corporation like this? What's the equivalent today, right? Maybe like an Amazon or something. Just millions of people kind of being controlled by this one company in 1785. When they started in the 1600s, they had a staff of 6 people, and they were managed out of one of the owner's houses. All right, so jump ahead to the 1800s. In 1813, the British government starts to take away the company's monopoly of the tea trade. In 1819, though, the impact of this company continues to show itself. Sir Stamford Raffles, here's a connection to the hotel that was mentioned earlier. I did not make that connection until right now. He purchased the island of Singapore on behalf of the company from their ruler, the Sultan of Johor, and creates what would eventually become one of the world's largest transshipment ports, right? The impact of the British East India Company is truly global, right? So from 1834 to 1857, the British East India Company kind of functions as a government agency. Of course, then 1839, during that period, 1839 to 1842, you have the Opium Wars. In 1857, you have the India Mutiny, and that's when the Colonial Office actually takes full control. And then 1873, the company is finally disbanded. So here you have an organization that started in the 1600s. It was officially sanctioned or given its license in 1600, the last day of the year of 1600, and it's disbanded in 1873. So almost 3 centuries of impact of this one company. And it's just absolutely incredible to think about the impact it would have had just on individual lives, right? The ability to sell or buy tea, right? And tea becomes such a strength, full-on British tradition. And so we think about today that we all, I sit and have a cup of tea, especially in the winter, in the afternoons, and I think about the impact of these different organizations and what they would have, what would have life looked like today if they hadn't been able to bring in tea in such massive quantities? Would it be such a big part of UK culture and even American culture today, right? So it's just really interesting to me, and I hope that some of that history review was helpful and interesting to all of you as well. I'm going to go back through our comments and look it through. I know a lot of you have still been talking about the Mayflower, which is always interesting. Claire asked about the Mayflower steps. Are they, somewhere in England, are they to do with the Mayflower? The steps are in Plymouth. Thank you, Judy. And yes, they do have to do with the Mayflower. They're directly tied. So absolutely, the Mayflower steps are part of that story. Darius was with us. Darius, it's good to see you. Haven't talked to you for a while. Loving all the details. Thanks, Darius. Appreciate that. Andy with that fantastic comment about the equivalent of £1 million back in 1650. I think that's always an interesting perspective, right? Even when I don't know, in many of the U.S. Census records, they had to state what their value was, what their property value was, or their personal value. And I almost always go back and do, Google the equivalent. What was, £1 million in 1850, or, $200 in 1900? What does that look like today? It's always an interesting correlation. George comments that the British East India Company had millions of pounds made by selling opium to the Chinese without the knowledge of the British government at the time that they had to ask for £1 million loan. If they'd known this at the time, they could have just taken it off the East India Company. Yeah. So I started to get into some of that as well, George, that whole other side of the story about the opium. And I didn't feel like I had a lot of time for it today, but, really fascinating, right? I mean, yeah, how would have things been different? Imagine what could have happened if the British government had known about that part of their illegal trade. Nikki says she used to sing a hymn, about the Speedwell when she was a child. About the flower, I guess. Yes, the flower, not the boat. Okay, good. Yeah, fantastic sharing. This is good. Oh, George had also commented that a lot of British historians had looked at the American Revolution as the English Civil War Part 2. Yeah, absolutely. I'm actually reading, rereading now. I read it once and I'm starting over again to get the details. There's a really great book, and I don't have it right in front of me. I'd have to get the title, but it's the history of the lead up to the Revolutionary War, the American Revolution, from the British perspective. So it really goes into a lot of these details about the British East India Company and how all of this kind of played all together and all the different forces at work, right? It really wasn't just about taxes on the colonies just for nothing. There was all these problems at play that Parliament was trying to solve, and it's just a really interesting look at history. All right, let's see what else we've got. Allie says we were taught about the Boston Tea Party at school, and yeah, I think that's pretty common, right? It's certainly a well-known event in history, but the details of it and how it all actually managed to occur are kind of tucked away, right? Not really talked about very much. Daphne had to leave, but thank you for joining us, and keep safe. Yep. Jonathan says the EIC used to have an imposing building in Leadenhall Street, now where Lloyd's of London, but no trace left. Oh, that's too bad. I wonder though, if there is any, are there other buildings? I'll have to look because I don't know. But are there any, is there any other architectural evidence of the East India Company? I would have to think so, right? It was such a powerful company. Oh, Karen's correction. Yep, not illegal to trade opium at the time. Yeah, thank you, Karen. Judy says she just seen the musical Hamilton. It was set at the start of the Revolutionary War and throughout that period. And yes, absolutely. I love Hamilton. I'm a big fan. And thankfully, so is my 11-year-old daughter, teaching her history one lyric at a time, which is fun. But Hamilton's now been made into a movie. It's a Broadway show, but it's available as a movie now. It's made my quarantine experience a whole lot better, I have to be honest, right? Because I've watched it many, many times. Yeah. Okay, let's see. There's a pretty big comment here from Maura. An American friend told me that she had ancestors who traveled on the Mayflower, and as she phrased it, she had Native American ancestors waiting to meet them when the Pilgrims landed. Her father was serving in the USAF, and his family came from Kellogg, Idaho. That's an interesting way to phrase that. Now, when the Pilgrims landed, the Wampanoags in Massachusetts, which is the native peoples to that area, had actually struggled through several years of disease and famine, and other tribes taking advantage of their low numbers and their kind of unlucky events of the last few years. So the Wampanoags did help the Pilgrims quite a bit. They needed each other to a certain extent. And so there certainly were native peoples sitting there with, helping the people on the Pilgrims on the Mayflower. But yeah, Native American ancestors waiting to meet them. I don't know if they were expecting them so much. I don't think that they got the memo that they were coming. Okay, that was a joke. All right. Let's just go through the last couple of comments here. Colin says a drama running in the UK at the moment entitled Outlander starts in Scotland in 1745, runs through to the American Revolution around 1780, maybe beyond. Yeah, I've heard about it. I haven't found it yet on any of the networks or tools, apps, live streaming, whatever that I've been able to find, although I haven't really looked too seriously. I'm sure I could find it, but I've certainly heard about it. I know some of my colleagues watch it, talk about it. So I would really love to see that, actually. I enjoy those kinds of shows. Nikki says, I had heard only recently that the EIC was involved in the run-up to the American Revolution. Some of my Irish wild geese relatives fought in the U.S. in the Irish Regiment, and others made their fortune in France, carrying on the slave trade. So many connections. You're right, Nikki. And I think, I'm just, from my perspective, right, I'm one of the very few American employees at Findmypast. And one of my jobs, really, is to actually look at a British record collection and say, all right, how is this interesting to North American researchers? How do we get North American researchers to know about this data set and actually build the correlation? And I've been thinking a lot about the upcoming 1921 census. And to Nikki's point, there's just so many connections, right? And I think it's always fascinating for me, and this is probably a result of my 7 years with the company, but I'm constantly looking at resources in terms of how can I dig into this from a different perspective, right? I spend a lot of time in the British Newspaper Archive in our newspaper collection researching American events, right? How was the assassination of President Lincoln covered in the UK, in UK newspapers? I just think it's a fascinating way to do genealogical research. So I'm just really excited. Okay, let's see. Oh, it's on Amazon Prime. Oh, good. It's very good. The books that I've been told are good too. Okay, so that's the Outlander series we're talking about on Amazon Prime or on Netflix or on the Stars app. Thank you all very much. I will certainly look for it. Outlander's based on a book by Gabaldon, says Bev. Yes, I have seen the books. And I should probably read them before I watch the show, I guess. So that's fantastic. Welcome, Gary. Looks like he's just joined. So that's always fun to have people commenting. And again, ask your questions, right? So we've had a good discussion. I hope it's been useful. I hope it's been interesting. And for those who had other specific questions about the U.S., I'll try to go back again through the comments and see if I can be helpful at all. But some good discussion today, so thank you all very much for joining us. Niles shared some links, so be sure to look back. There's some exclusive East India Company records available on Findmypast as part of our partnership with the British Library. We're always excited to have exploration in historical records. And so if you take a look at those collections and you find something, let us know. Share your stories and share what you discover so we can continue this conversation. It's fantastic. And also keep up with the Findmypast forum group, right? Really great resource as well. Nikki says, I find the idea of a stock market before computers to be almost unthinkable. Yeah, me too. Back to the Outlander series. Sometimes it's better to read the book after the series. Well, I agree, June. That's true. That's a good point. But I really, I wonder, right, with the Outlander, it seems like it would be a detailed book to get into. And a couple other comments about the books. Audrey, talking about connections. There's lots of Americans in the 1939 register, and this is so true, actually. Joe Kennedy, Eleanor Roosevelt, excuse me. All sorts of people. And that's so true. And, so I Audrey, to your comment, I really like finding people in the 1939 register and then seeing if I can duplicate that search in the 1940 census in the U.S. and seeing, like, you know, because they're just a few months apart in reality. And so how do they bridge the ocean in that? You know, it's really such a short window of time that it's really easy to capture their activities from 1939 register to 1940 census. It's always good fun. All right. So a couple comments. Allie's saying I really should revisit some of my ancestry. Allie, please do. You know, this is a great time to do it. And we've got great things going on at Find My Past. So please do take a look. Andy asks, I'm aware that the English painter and social critic William Hogarth observed in 1757 that tea is not considered manly in the U.S. Is that still the case? I don't know if I am aware of any kind of stereotypes around tea and feminism or masculinity. I don't know. I mean, certainly coffee is a much more prevalent beverage in the U.S. than tea, but I don't know if I have a good answer for you on that one, Andy. But maybe something to talk about on a future Friday. I'll look into it. That's interesting. I don't know. I'll definitely look up the quote. Tea is not considered manly in the U.S. I'm sure historically, I'm sure that would probably be very true. You know, in the colonies, the connection to Britain, especially before the American Revolution, was absolutely cultural, right? Colonists, were definitely trying to recreate British life. And I've read accounts where they say that actually they're, you know, like in Boston, the city of Boston, it was more British in Boston than it was in many communities in England, right, at the time. So I don't know if, you know, so certainly the culture of having afternoon tea and tea parlors and all the traditions around having tea service, that was certainly a very important part of American culture early on. So that would be interesting. All right. Oh, Audrey says she started making a list a while ago, and I'm sure she must find it again. The 1939 Register, Americans in the 1939 Register. And Dina says read the books first with Outlander. She did a great job with the history. So I guess we have votes for both directions. We'll eventually I'll have to read the books and watch the show. So we'll see. And Darius, one last comment before we go. We just have a couple minutes left. My maternal grandfather drank tea. He was a farmer and rancher in Idaho. So I drink tea pretty regularly and consistently. And I buy British tea, by the way. I'm kind of particular about it. I do not buy... I buy good brands. Let's say it that way. But yeah, I think I'm the only one in my family actually who drinks tea regularly. I don't know of anybody else. So it's interesting just to see kind of how that culture incorporates. I also drink a lot of coffee, so I don't know, maybe it's just the caffeine for me. And Hillary says, I've heard that some things from Britain have lasted in the US longer than in the UK. I think that's really true, actually. And especially with the increase in genealogy, the increase in DNA, there's a huge move, especially in the United States, to really think about where you come from and what your culture is. And DNA certainly helps with that. And my DNA test, for example, I am really British and Irish, right? Like I don't have very much else in me. So definitely learning a lot more about the British culture and incorporating that into kind of our family events, sharing that with my siblings, my parents, trying to incorporate that kind of into our regular, like our family traditions, our holiday traditions and things like that. All right. So it's been a great hour. Thank you all so much for joining me today. There's a couple of last comments. Oh, PG tips only on the tea brand. Thanks, June. I do drink PG tips once in a while. I'm pretty sure that's what our London office has in stock too. If I remember right, it's been a while since I've been back to London, of course. All right. So we hope that all of you remain safe and healthy. As we work through everything that's going on in the world right now. We really look forward to these chats on Friday. It's all about you guys and the community. We love hearing from you. So please share your stories throughout the week on our Facebook page or on Find My Past forum. in the on Facebook, and we will see you back here next week. I don't know who's doing it. I didn't check the schedule, but we'll have new records to share and new discussions, and we wish you all a healthy week until then. So thanks very much for joining us, and stay chatting. Right, we'll talk to you on Facebook. Thank you all so much. Well, look at that. I actually don't know how to turn it off. It's funny. And okay, everybody, I'm done mumbling to myself. Have a great day.